There is a peculiar moment in the life of every great civilization when danger is no longer theoretical, yet remains politely unacknowledged. The institutions still function. The rituals of public life continue. The language of stability remains intact. And yet beneath this surface composure, something essential has already fractured. History teaches us that collapse rarely arrives announcing itself as collapse. It arrives disguised as continuity. Daily life persists. Commerce flows. Public debates remain civilized in form, even as their substance decays. The illusion of permanence holds, not because it is true, but because it is comforting. The most perilous belief a society can hold is not that it is perfect, but that it is exempt. Exempt from history. Exempt from decay. Exempt from the patterns that have governed human organization for centuries. Every society that later shattered believed this. Not arrogantly, but sincerely. They believed their institutions too old, their legal frameworks too refined, their moral narratives too advanced to fail in the manner of those who came before. They were mistaken. Revolution, as history understands it, is not born from chaos. It emerges from order that has lost its legitimacy while retaining its form. It is not poverty that ignites it, but contradiction. A contradiction between expectation and reality, between promise and delivery, between what a system claims to be and what it increasingly proves itself unable to sustain. This contradiction does not announce itself loudly. At first, it is discussed in essays, in drawing rooms, in private correspondence. It is expressed as unease rather than anger, as irony rather than rebellion. Only later does it become visible in the streets. Modern revolutions, when examined without sentiment, follow a remarkably consistent sequence. Not because humans are predictable in spirit, but because systems respond predictably to strain. The first stage is not unrest. It is inequality that becomes visible, persistent, and humiliating. Inequality alone is insufficient. Humanity has always lived with disparity. What matters is perception. When privilege ceases to appear functional and begins to appear decorative, resentment becomes structural. When reward no longer appears connected to contribution, legitimacy begins to erode. History records this moment with unsettling consistency. In late 18th century Europe, privilege was not merely economic. It was legal, visible, and unanswerable. Certain classes were exempt from burdens others carried. Their lives unfolded in parallel worlds. This alone did not cause rupture. What transformed imbalance into instability was stagnation. The system could no longer adapt without threatening those who benefited most from its rigidity. When reform threatens privilege, privilege resists reform, even when resistance accelerates collapse. This is the second stage, institutional paralysis. The mechanisms of governance continue to operate, but only superficially. Decisions are delayed. Responsibility diffuses. Problems are managed rhetorically rather than resolved structurally. Debt accumulates. Financial, moral, political. Confidence erodes not because leaders lack intelligence, but because they lack freedom of action. This paralysis radicalizes the educated middle. Contrary to popular myth, revolutions are rarely initiated by the desperate. They are initiated by those who understand the system well enough to recognize its limits. Lawyers, writers, professionals, administrators, individuals whose lives are intertwined with institutional function, become the first to withdraw belief. This withdrawal is decisive. Once belief evaporates among those who interpret and operate the system, legitimacy collapses rapidly. This is the third stage, the moral delegitimization of authority. Institutions still exist. Laws still apply. Offices are still occupied, but their moral gravity weakens. Decisions are obeyed out of habit rather than conviction, and habit, once questioned, dissolves quickly. The fourth stage follows with alarming speed. Trust fragments. Courts are accused of bias, media of manipulation, universities of indoctrination. Not necessarily because these accusations are always true, but because belief has already withdrawn. At this point, society no longer shares a common arbiter of truth. Without shared trust, disagreement escalates. Politics ceases to be procedural and becomes existential. Opponents are no longer mistaken. They are dangerous. This is the moment history regards as decisive, because from here, the question is no longer whether the system should be reformed. It is whether it deserves to survive. Revolutionary movements thrive precisely at this juncture, not because they offer accurate diagnoses, but because they offer certainty. They promise coherence in a world that feels incoherent. They replace complexity with clarity and patience with urgency. The old order is declared irredeemable. Acceleration becomes virtue. What follows is almost always justified as necessity, emergency measures, temporary suspensions, exceptional powers. History preserves these words carefully. They appear in every archive. They never mean what they claim. Because once legality is subordinated to moral urgency, restraint evaporates. This is the fifth stage, the justification of transgression. Rules become obstacles. Procedure becomes weakness. Moderation becomes complicity. Those who resist excess are accused of defending injustice. Those who hesitate are labeled collaborators. Silence spreads, and silence in such conditions is not neutrality. It is survival. The final stage arrives swiftly. Power recenters itself, not around law, but around force, justified as protection. The revolution consumes its own language and emerges as authority. Not because this outcome was desired, but because exhaustion demands order. This is the pattern. It does not belong to a nation, an ideology, or a century. It belongs to structure. The uncomfortable question is not whether this pattern exists. It is whether contemporary societies recognize where they stand within it. Because history offers one final, unforgiving lesson. Once a society enters the later stages of this cycle, reversal becomes exponentially difficult. Reform must occur before belief collapses. Afterward, only control remains. In the next part, we will examine the most misunderstood aspect of this sequence: why advanced, educated, and prosperous societies often move through it faster than poorer, weaker ones, and why confidence, rather than fragility, is the most dangerous condition of all. One of history's most persistent ironies is this: the more advanced a society becomes, the faster it collapses once legitimacy erodes. Poverty does not produce revolution on its own. Illiteracy does not produce it either. Expectation does. The societies that fall most violently are not those accustomed to hardship, but those accustomed to progress. When improvement becomes the norm, stagnation feels like betrayal. This is the second great misunderstanding of historical collapse. Stability is assumed to be self-sustaining. Progress is assumed to be automatic. Neither assumption survives contact with reality. In advanced societies, the relationship between effort and reward becomes the moral spine of legitimacy. Individuals accept inequality so long as it appears functional, so long as contribution seems connected to outcome and advancement remains plausible. When this connection weakens, resentment does not immediately become rebellion. It becomes irony. Cynicism spreads through educated classes long before it reaches the desperate. Satire replaces respect. Institutions become objects of mockery rather than reverence. This phase is often misinterpreted as cultural decline. In truth, it is political decay, because legitimacy is not sustained by law alone. It is sustained by belief. When belief fades, enforcement must increase. This marks a critical transition. Rules that were once followed voluntarily now require assertion. Authority that once operated invisibly must now announce itself. And the more authority insists, the more it exposes its fragility. This tension is visible across every late-stage system in history. Public life becomes performative. Declarations multiply. Moral language intensifies. These are not signs of strength. They are compensations for doubt. As inequality deepens and mobility narrows, the educated middle begins to experience a uniquely destabilizing emotion: humiliation. Not material deprivation, but symbolic exclusion. They possess credentials, but not influence, knowledge, but not authority, responsibility without agency. This group is historically decisive. They are articulate enough to diagnose problems, but sufficiently excluded to feel betrayed. When they conclude that reform is no longer possible, they do not withdraw quietly. They radicalize discourse. This is the third structural acceleration. Complex problems are reframed as moral failures. Institutional inertia becomes evidence of corruption. Nuance is interpreted as evasion. Language hardens. Once language hardens, compromise becomes impossible. At this point, the society begins to fracture epistemically. Different groups no longer disagree within a shared framework. They inhabit separate realities. They trust different sources. They recognize different authorities. They respond to different moral triggers. This fragmentation is lethal to continuity. A society can survive disagreement. It cannot survive incompatible truths. The fourth stage manifests here. Institutions that once mediated conflict lose their integrative function. Courts are accused of partiality regardless of outcome. Media is dismissed regardless of evidence. Education is reinterpreted as indoctrination rather than transmission. What matters is not whether these accusations are justified. What matters is that belief has collapsed. Without belief, procedure loses force. Law becomes suggestion. Norms become optional. This is where modern observers often make a fatal error. They assume that the presence of elections, courts, and formal process prevents collapse. History offers no support for this assumption. Forms persist long after substance has vanished. Elections can occur in illegitimate systems. Courts can operate without trust. Constitutions can exist without authority. What sustains a system is not its architecture, but its acceptance. When acceptance is withdrawn, outcomes accelerate. The fifth stage approaches quietly. Moral justification replaces legality. Actions are no longer judged by adherence to rule, but by alignment with perceived justice. This is the most seductive moment in any revolutionary sequence, because it allows individuals to feel righteous while violating constraints. Exceptional measures become normalized, transgression becomes ethical, restraint becomes suspect. History records this moment with chilling consistency. Once violence, physical or institutional, is justified against the right targets, escalation becomes inevitable, not because people are cruel, but because systems reward decisiveness in moments of perceived emergency. Moderates retreat, radicals advance, and power flows toward those least troubled by its exercise. The tragedy is that this process often unfolds beneath the language of virtue. Each step is framed as defense, each excess as necessity. By the time exhaustion sets in, reversal is no longer an option. Order will return. It always does. But it will not resemble what was lost. The final consolidation is rarely democratic, rarely pluralistic, and rarely restrained. It is administrative, designed to prevent recurrence rather than preserve liberty. This is not conjecture. It is pattern, and patterns, once recognized, are difficult to unsee. In the next part, we will examine the most dangerous illusion of all, the belief that awareness alone prevents repetition. We will explore why knowledge of history so often fails to alter its trajectory, and what, if anything, has ever succeeded in interrupting the cycle before it completes itself. There is a comforting belief shared by most advanced societies at the edge of rupture. That knowledge inoculates. That education protects. That awareness alters outcomes. History is unsparing in its verdict. It does not. The societies that collapse most completely are often those most intimately familiar with the failures of their predecessors. Their libraries are full. Their universities flourish. Their commentators are sophisticated, eloquent, and historically literate. And yet, the pattern repeats. The reason lies not in ignorance, but in timing. Historical awareness does not fail because it is false. It fails because it arrives too late. By the time a society begins openly discussing the possibility of systemic collapse, legitimacy has usually already eroded beyond recovery. At this stage, knowledge functions less as warning and more as justification. Examples are drawn not to prevent excess, but to normalize it. History becomes weaponized. Each faction selects its precedents. Each side frames itself as heir to virtue and casts its opponents as reincarnations of historical villains. This is not misuse of history. It is its most common political function. Once moral narratives harden, facts become secondary. What matters is alignment. The past is no longer consulted. It is recruited. This marks the sixth psychological transition of the cycle. History ceases to be teacher and becomes arsenal. Those who attempt nuance are dismissed as evasive. Those who insist on complexity are accused of complicity. Silence spreads not because people agree, but because disagreement carries risk. This is the point at which elites, particularly intellectual elites, misunderstand their own position. They assume that because they are informed, they are protected. They are not. Historically, educated classes are among the first to be marginalized once revolutionary consolidation begins. They are useful during destabilization. They are threatening during reconstruction. This is not cruelty. It is logic. Individuals trained to critique power are liabilities to systems seeking control. Revolutionary regimes rarely tolerate ambiguity once authority is secured. The transition from moral fervor to administrative enforcement is swift. Committees replace debates. Directives replace discourse. Loyalty replaces competence. This shift is often mistaken for restoration. In reality, it is contraction. The system narrows itself to ensure survival. Pluralism, once celebrated, becomes inefficiency. Dissent, once defended, becomes risk. And risk in a traumatized society is intolerable. The tragedy is that many participants recognize this too late. They supported exceptional measures believing them temporary. They justified excess believing it necessary. They remained silent, believing themselves prudent. By the time consolidation is complete, the language of reversal has vanished. What remains is order. Brittle, watchful, and deeply suspicious of deviation. At this point, observers often ask the wrong question. They ask how the collapse happened so suddenly. The answer is that it did not. It unfolded gradually, politely, and with impeccable reasoning at every step. Each decision was defensible in isolation. Each compromise seemed small. Together, they produced inevitability. This is why revolutions feel shocking only to those who ignored accumulation. The warning signs were visible. They were simply normalized. This leads to the final misconception. That collapse announces itself with drama? It does not. It feels administrative. Meetings replace debates. Rules proliferate. Compliance is praised. The language of emergency becomes permanent. And permanence is the final betrayal of all temporary measures. Once embedded, such systems rarely dismantle themselves voluntarily. They endure until displaced. Not by argument, but by exhaustion or external shock. This is why the window for reversal is always earlier than assumed. Reform is effective only while institutions retain moral authority. Once authority is replaced by enforcement, change requires disruption. And disruption carries costs that societies consistently underestimate. The cycle, once advanced beyond this point, narrows possibilities. What remains is management of decline or consolidation of control. Neither preserves what was lost. In the final part, we will step back from chronology and consider the deeper implication of this pattern. What it reveals not about any single society, but about power itself, and why the most dangerous moment in history is not crisis, but confidence that crisis has been avoided. Every civilization that has endured long enough eventually confronts the same paradox. The qualities that once ensured its stability gradually become the very forces that undermine it. Confidence hardens into complacency. Continuity becomes assumption. Success is mistaken for immunity. This is not failure of character. It is the natural consequence of longevity. Systems designed to solve yesterday's problems persist long after those problems have vanished. Institutions that once embodied adaptability become guardians of precedent. Procedures that once protected liberty slowly calcify into ritual. At first, this rigidity is invisible. It feels like order. Only later does it reveal itself as incapacity. The revolutionary cycle does not punish wickedness. It punishes inflexibility. This is why the collapse of advanced societies feels so perplexing to those who experience it. From within, nothing appears dramatically wrong. The trains still run. The courts still convene. The language of law and rights remains intact. And yet, legitimacy has thinned, not vanished, thinned. That distinction matters because societies do not fall when people lose everything. They fall when they lose faith. Faith that institutions serve more than themselves. Faith that rules apply evenly? Faith that the future remains open. Once that faith erodes, even the most elegant constitutional architecture becomes decorative. History offers no exception to this rule. Not Rome, not ancien regimes, not modern republics. Each believed its refinement distinguished it from those that came before. Each discovered that refinement does not confer exemption. The final stage of the cycle is often misunderstood as resolution. In reality, it is accommodation. Exhausted by uncertainty, societies accept concentration of authority not because they desire domination, but because they crave predictability. Order becomes the supreme virtue. Liberty, once cherished, is reinterpreted as risk. Pluralism, once celebrated, is reframed as inefficiency. This transition is not imposed. It is invited. And once invited, it is rarely revoked. The administrators of the new order present themselves not as rulers, but as custodians. They promise to manage, to stabilize, to protect. They are believed because belief has become necessity. What emerges is not tyranny in the theatrical sense, but something quieter and more enduring. A system that prioritizes control over consent, compliance over conviction, continuity over debate. Such systems can persist for generations. They are efficient. They are predictable. They are resistant to shock. What they are not is free. And yet, history does not moralize this outcome. It records it. The cycle does not exist to condemn. It exists to describe. Understanding it does not guarantee avoidance. But ignorance ensures repetition. The most sobering lesson is this: collapse is rarely recognized as collapse while it is occurring. It is recognized later, when alternatives have vanished. This is why the most dangerous moment in any society's life is not open crisis. It is the moment when crisis is believed to have been averted, when temporary measures are normalized, and when vigilance is replaced by relief. That is when the cycle completes itself quietly, not with catastrophe, but with acceptance. If there is any restraint history offers, it lies not in prediction, but in humility. The humility to recognize that no system is final, that no arrangement is permanent, that stability must be continually earned, not merely inherited. Societies that endure longest are not those that proclaim their virtue most loudly. They are those that adapt earliest, sacrifice privilege voluntarily, and reform before legitimacy collapses. These are not dramatic acts. They do not produce heroes. They produce continuity. If you have followed this reflection to its end, you have engaged with history not as reassurance, but as warning. Not a warning of inevitable catastrophe, but of predictable consequence. Such engagement is rare. It requires patience. It requires restraint. It requires the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than demand resolution. If this analysis has sharpened your understanding rather than comforted your assumptions, it has served its purpose. A thoughtful remark signals that depth still matters. A quiet endorsement allows ideas like this to circulate beyond those already convinced. And if there is one person whose judgment you respect, someone with whom disagreement leads to insight rather than division, sharing this reflection may begin a conversation worth having. Civilizations do not change through slogans. They change through understanding, slowly, imperfectly, and often just in time.